So welcome again to the third session in our series about grants, federal grants management, hosted by the Watershed Research and Training Center and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. We are thankful for support for this webinar series from the Forest Service's Community Navigators initiative, and glad to be here with the team with Kelley Nonprofit Consulting, who are going to take it away with their presentation today. So I'll hand it over to you all. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Emery. Hi, everybody. Just reintroducing myself. My name is Kyle Stokely, and I'm the Director of Nonprofit Financial Services here at Kelley Nonprofit Consulting. We're going to quickly go over what we covered in session 2, and then we're going to jump right into all things procurement and subgranting. Okay, so just a quick refresher. So in session 2, we covered financial management systems and kind of the requirements for an entity's financial management system, what it needs to be able to do, that it needs to identify, account for, and document all income and expenses associated with your federal award. It's important also to determine that, whether or not your financial management system is equipped to handle an award before you apply for one. It's important to get input from all departments at your organization and any key stakeholders involved during your budget development process for a federal award, and also for your organizational budget too. And then it's also important to use your accounting software, which is a component of your financial management system, using that software to track income and expenses by grant, tracking direct and indirect costs, and then also tracking functional expense categories. And that's applicable to you if you are a 501c3. We also talked about documentation and using secure systems to ensure that records can be retrieved when needed, right? If they're asked, if you need to provide documentation for an auditor or for the federal awarding agency, to have them in a secure location, and hopefully more than one secure location. Then also, it's worth remembering that income, in-kind contributions of goods or services, or even unrecovered indirect costs that have been used as match funding for one federal award can't be applied to any other federal awards. There's no double dipping allowed. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide and dive into procurement and subawards. But before we do that, sorry, we do have a little question to get your mind working before we jump into procurement. So from session 2, we talked about match funding quite a bit, and if you could get out a calculator, write it down on a piece of paper, drop it in the chat, or just think about it. We are going to ask you, what is the total project cost of a $150,000 federal award that requires a 60-40 match? So the federal awarding agency is saying, here, we're going to give you $150,000, but we are requiring a 60-40 match on this award. So how would you find the total project costs associated with that federal award? Okay. So essentially, with a federal award that requires a match, we're going to take the amount that they are covering, the percentage that they are covering, and so we'll take the federal award and divide it by that percentage. So we would do 150,000 divided by 60%, which would give you $250,000. So essentially what that means is they're covering 60% of the project, and the other 40% needs to be covered by you. So we need to find that from other restricted funding sources that are funding this project, or maybe some of our unrestricted reserves. So $150,000 federal award, 60-40 match, $250,000 total project cost. Okay, I hope that's clear. If you have any questions about that, you can drop them in the Q&A. Okay, today's topics, we are kind of going over the meat and potatoes of what pass-through, subrecipients, and contractor responsibilities are, different procurement methods, formal and informal, the difference between sealed bids and proposals, conflicts of interest, we're going to cover that a little bit, and then other federal standards like Davis-Bacon Act. Okay, so let's start off with some subgranting definitions. I think it's important that we understand the terminology. So pass-through entity, that is a recipient or a subrecipient receiving, or sorry, providing a subaward to a subrecipient. So there can be multiple layers of subgranting occurring under a federal award, but if you're a pass-through entity if you are dispersing a subaward. Now, a subrecipient is who's receiving the subaward, right? And then separately, there's a contractor, and a contractor is the entity that is receiving a contract, which is usually done in the form of procurement. And it's worth remembering that you can be a pass-through entity on one federal award, but you can act as maybe a subrecipient or even a contractor on another federal award. And just make sure that if that's the case, that there's no overlap in expenses, right? We don't want to be double counting expenses anywhere in that process. So let's go through some of the pass-through responsibilities under a federal award. So first and foremost, whether a disbursement is a subaward or a procurement contract, that's going to be determined by the pass-through entity. Okay. We're going to go through kind of maybe some of the differences between subawards and contracts in a minute, but it's important to note that the pass-through entity is the one determining whether this disbursement qualifies as a subaward or a procurement contract. So in your subaward agreement, here's some of the requirements that need to be included in that, or some of the components that should be included in the subaward. So first and foremost, you should have the subrecipient's name and unique entity identifier. You should have the federal award ID number. You should have a description of the project. You should list the performance period, right? So the start and end dates of the project. You also should include the indirect cost rate that is applicable to the subrecipient, right? So that indirect cost rate, it could be the de minimis rate if they don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. But if they do have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, that would either be negotiated with the pass-through entity or the subrecipient's federal cognizant agency. So we have to include which indirect cost rate the subrecipient is going to be using throughout the course of this project. Let's go through some more pass-through responsibilities. So the pass-through entity assumes liability for the award. So they're primarily liable for the award, but subrecipients also have to comply with the requirements that are imposed on the pass-through entity or the lead applicant, you'll sometimes hear. So the pass-through entity is primarily liable, but the subrecipients also have to abide by the standards that are going to be listed out in the grant agreement. The pass-through entity is also responsible for evaluating subrecipient fraud and non-compliance risk. We're going to talk about that a little more, but basically in the Uniform Guidance or the Code of Federal Regulations, there's a lot of considerations that the pass-through entity must take into account when you're evaluating subrecipient risk. Okay, so these can include whether the subrecipient undergoes a single audit regularly, right? That tends to decrease risk. If the subrecipient has had high personnel turnover, that'll generally increase the risk of fraud and non-compliance. And then also just, what other historical experience the pass-through entity has had with the subrecipient. So all of these factors go into the subrecipient risk. So not only do we have to evaluate, fraud and risk factors, but we also have to evaluate, as the pass-through entity, we have to evaluate the financial management system of subrecipients, right? So the pass-through entity needs to evaluate its own financial management system as well as those of subrecipients. And we need to be monitoring those subrecipients during the course of the performance period, right? So we're going to need to be reviewing financial and performance reports, right? These are going to be either they're going to draw those down from their accounting software, or they're going to be producing performance reports elsewhere, and those should be stored securely, remember. the pass-through entity also needs to issue a management decision as to whether prior audit findings have been addressed and resolved. So if the subrecipient did undergo a single audit in the past, if there were any significant findings there, the pass-through entity needs to determine whether they've been addressed and resolved. And if they haven't, then working with the subrecipient to improve their systems and processes that are related to those findings. And then also the pass-through entity needs to offer technical assistance potentially, which could involve tracking tools, right? Maybe time tracking spreadsheets, other proactive means of addressing the weaknesses discovered by the auditor. And all of this can help reduce the risk of non-compliance and fraud, and kind of help to bolster the financial management system of the subrecipient. There's quite a bit there that pertains to pass-through entities, and those responsibilities can be numerous and significant. So we get this question a lot. What's the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor? I mean, the Code of Federal Regulations states that the substance of the relationship is more important than the form of the agreement between a pass-through entity and a subrecipient or a contractor. So in general, subrecipients, they act alongside, they operate alongside the pass-through entity to achieve goals of the federal project. They have to abide by the same requirements as the pass-through entity. And in general, they carry out programs that are intended to benefit the public. Whereas contractors, they're awarded a competitive procurement contract, right? They operate independently of the pass-through entity. And the trade or business that they're engaged in is kind of tangential, right? It's an auxiliary goal to the federally funded program. So it's not the primary goal. Maybe they're constructing a building of some sort, but that's not the main goal of the federally funded program. It's just it's tangential to it, and it's worth remembering that pass-through entities need to be monitoring subrecipients, but they also need to be monitoring contractors, right? So they need to make sure that the contractor performance is according with any signed contracts they have, or maybe purchase orders that they've received. So you have to monitor contractors, but it's not going to be as rigorous of a monitoring process or as extensive of a process as it is for subrecipients. So that's subrecipients versus contractors in a nutshell. So which of the following would suggest that an entity is a subrecipient? So not a contractor, but a subrecipient. So if the entity provides services in the normal course of business, if they offer services on the open market, provide goods solely for the benefit of the pass-through entity, or adhere to the requirements specified in the federal award. So under which of these options would we get the inclination that the entity is a subrecipient? Yeah, if you want to put take a guess and drop it in the chat box, or just think of it, that would be great. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. D. So if they're adhering to the requirements specified in the federal award, odds are they are a subrecipient, right? Because the subrecipient needs to abide by the federal award requirements in the same way that the pass-through entity needs to. And if you're struggling to determine whether an entity is a subrecipient or a contractor, it's important that you maybe compile the relevant facts, right? Kind of delineate the situation, and send it to your point of contact at the federal awarding agency and ask them, hey, does this sound to you like a subrecipient, or do they sound more like a contractor, right? Again, it's the substance of the relationship between the pass-through entity and the either the subrecipient or the contractor. It's the substance of that relationship that determines whether they qualify for subrecipient or contractor status. Okay, let's go through some procurement standards. So this part of the Code of Federal Regulations is extensive. There is quite a lot on procurement. It's a very important component of the uniform guidance. And so obviously, because of that, it's going to be important for your organization to have a procurement policy in place. And what that procurement policy should do kind of at bottom is cover the basic standards listed in the Code of Federal Regulations or the uniform guidance, right? So federal award applications, they might require your organization to describe the procurement policy that you have on file, or at least affirm that it comports with the uniform guidance. So you'll encounter one of those two questions in the federal award application. And it's worth remembering, so we need policies in place, right? We need written policies for procurement, but also we need to implement those policies. So we need procedures to go along with those. And I think one way to do that, and to implement sound procurement practices, is to have a bit of a cheat sheet on file where you kind of summarize the most crucial procurement do's and don'ts, right? What the thresholds are, how many RFPs do we need? At what point can we do we have to use formal methods and so on, right? So having this cheat sheet will help personnel that are actually implementing the policies get by on a daily basis. So what should the procurement policy include? So this is a non-exhaustive list, but it should describe how your organization oversees contractor performance, and then ensuring that the terms and conditions in the contract are met. So monitoring contractors is important. It should include some conflict of interest standards, right? That essentially prevent or help to prevent agents of the organization from procuring contracts with entities in which they have some financial interest or other interest, right? So how do we avoid these sorts of conflicts of interest? And then there should be a process in place to avoid unnecessary acquisitions or duplicative acquisitions, right? So we want to make sure that we're not buying the same thing twice, right? Or buying unnecessary things that actually don't pertain to the project at all, that might show up as a question cost in a single audit. What else should it cover? It should outline some of the record keeping methods that you have that demonstrate the rationale for procurement method used, right? So why did we choose this method? Why did we do sealed bid? Why did we do a proposal? What's the basis for these contract prices, right? Where do we have some comparable projects that we've worked on? What's the rationale that we have in place for accepting or rejecting contractors, right? That's something we're going to touch on later, but why do we accept the contractors that we do and why do we reject them? And then also how you set price ceilings on open-ended contracts, which are also known as time and materials contracts. And then especially when informal and formal procurement methods apply, right? So what those thresholds are, and we're going to go over those, I think, right about now. But not so fast. We're going to take a quick break because I know this session gets long. So we're going to take about 3 minutes for a quick break, and we will see you back soon.
And while we're on that break, we would welcome folks to think of any questions that you have for Kyle or Libby that you want them to address after the presentation. We only have one question in the lineup now, so there's lots of room for more questions. So we will see everyone back at 3 past the hour. And let us know if you have any other questions in the chat box as well. Thanks. Do you want to get started again then, Kyle?
Yeah, let's keep things going. Got a lot of material to cover. So hopefully everyone's back. Let's continue on discussing procurement and procurement thresholds. So there's informal and there's formal procurement methods. So informal methods are going to apply to expenditures below or to contracts below $250,000. And within this informal category, there's two subcategories. There's micro purchases and there's small purchases. Micro purchases are below 10,000, and the price of the goods or services that you're procuring have to be reasonable based on your experience or research or both. And you can increase the micro purchase threshold to $50,000, up to $50,000, provided that you self-certify and maintain documentation that demonstrates you're both a low-risk oddity and that you conduct an annual institutional risk assessment. So it's not exactly the easiest thing, right? You do need to perform this risk assessment annually. You need to document it. There's quite a bit of work that goes into it. And if you do those two things and your federal cognizant agency, so the agency that provides the majority of your funding, of your federal funding, if they approve that, then you can increase the micro purchase threshold. And so this can be very helpful for organizations that are maybe, making quite a bit of purchases between 10 and 50,000, or I guess 0 and $50,000. And so if you're, buying a bunch of stuff, procuring lots of services for $30,000, then if you increase that micro purchase threshold, then there's a lot less legwork that has to go into seeking out those goods and services and procuring them. But in general, if you don't have that approval from your cognizant agency, then anything below 10,000 can be micro purchase threshold, or can just be based on your research or your experience. You don't really need to provide much justification, but anything above that 10,000 is known as a small purchase, and that's going to not require formal competitive bidding procedures, right? But you're going to need to retrieve price quotes from a sufficient number of suppliers. And what is sufficient? That's kind of going to be dependent on your judgment and what you deem to be a prudent number of suppliers. And so that's between $10,000 and $250,000. So it's quite a range there, right? And then anything above $250,000 is going to require formal procurement methods. So those formal procurement methods are going to be sealed bids or proposals. We're going to go through those next. So a sealed bid, this is the method by which you award a fixed price contract to the lowest bidder. And then proposals, basically whenever a sealed bid is not practicable. And you're going to be awarding a fixed price or a cost reimbursement contract, not via a sealed bid. That will be known as a proposal. Okay, so sealed bids, you're going to we're going to use sealed bids when we can provide a full description or complete set of specifications of the goods or services required. Okay, when we can kind of verify that more than one vendor can compete for the bid, and when the selection of the bidder can be determined solely by price and not other factors. So we need to meet all three of these criteria in order to use a sealed bid. Now, sealed bids, we need to obtain them from an adequate number of vendors. And the uniform guidance doesn't define what adequate is, right? There's no quantification of adequate number of vendors. And so really it's, again, use your judgment to determine what constitutes adequate. Usually 3 or so is a good rule of thumb, but it really depends on the context. In your sealed bid, you need to provide a full list of specifications required of the goods and services that are to be provided. Your sealed bid needs to be opened at a predetermined time and place, and you need to award that that contract to the lowest responsive bid, and the bidder has to be responsible bidder. So the lowest cost, and to the entity, the company that can provide it responsibly and adequately, right? And it's worth noting that local governments, they have to publicly advertise their invitations for bids. So if you're a local government, remember this has to be done out in the public. We need to kind of release advertisements that's available to the general public to bid on a federal contract. So with sealed bids, we have to document our rationale for selecting the contractor that we selected, but we also have to document why we rejected those that we rejected, right? So maybe we rejected, so all of our rejections were solely on the basis of price, or maybe we had the lowest bid, but they didn't meet all of the specifications, right? And so that's why we had to reject them. So it had to be the lowest cost, but also the one that could meet all of the requirements that we listed in the RFP, request for proposal. So that's sealed bids in a nutshell. It's quite a bit that goes into it, but that's a general overview of sealed bids. Proposals, we're going to use these when sealed bids are not applicable, right? So proposals, we're going to use them on fixed price or cost reimbursement contracts. So fixed price, it's kind of in the name, right? The contract is awarded, here's the amount, right? Versus cost reimbursement, there's a little more flexibility within a range, but we're going to be reimbursing the vendor for any costs incurred in their manufacturing of the goods or delivery of the services. Proposals, we need public solicitation of them from multiple qualified entities. Again, use your judgment as to what constitutes multiple, what constitutes an adequate number, right? But with proposals, the uniform guidance specifies that they should be the award should be given to the responsible offerer whose proposal is most advantageous to the recipient, considering price and other factors. Okay, so it's not just price. There could be other factors that go into this. And within your procurement policy, you should be documenting how you evaluate and select proposals. So we need to document how we're dealing with the RFP process as well as the sealed bid process. And then we're going to talk a little later about non-competitive procurement. And so your procurement policy should cover kind of all of those cases. So there is a caveat here. So an exception is made for architectural or engineering services. So you can evaluate these proposals on a slightly different basis than other contracts. So again, price doesn't necessarily need to be the sole selection factor as it is with sealed bids. The most qualified offer is selected generally, right? And in the contract negotiation process, you should be using your judgment to determine what is fair and reasonable compensation. So there's a lot in the uniform guidance that kind of relies on the recipient's judgment, right, in carrying out these procurement contracts. But again, it's only applicable to architectural or engineering services. So it doesn't apply to other types of services or goods being manufactured. Okay, so we did get a question from the attendee survey that we sent out before the session. And the question was, if you're planning to contract out parts of a project and there's a desired partner, are there ways to be able to work with that partner while still complying with federal procurement policy? And so essentially what they're asking is, so we need to have we need to abide by competitive procurement processes, right? Where we're not giving an undue competitive advantage to any particular entity, and we're objectively carrying out the bidding or the RFP process. So, is there a way to do that, but also choose the desired partner to deliver those goods and services? So essentially, if the desired partner checks all the boxes, then yeah, absolutely. Um, but if the selection process isn't carried out objectively, then it's possible that, you know, your decision making is biased in that case, and you could be giving an undue competitive advantage to that desired partner. And I mean, it's just worth remembering that, you know, within the uniform guidance, we have these formal procurement requirements listed out to prevent organizations from using public dollars to basically enrich their friends or to enrich related parties, right? So we want to keep, you know, competition is key, and provided the process is carried out in accordance with those competitive requirements, then it should be fine, absolutely, to select a desired partner, right, on a contract. But non-competitive procurement can be used in certain cases. So as we mentioned, that micro purchase threshold of $10,000, right? We don't need any competitive procurement methods, right? We don't need multiple quotes retrieved. We can basically just pick, you know, from the vendor that is basically the most reasonable and that can provide us with the, you know, the best quality product for price, right? You can also use non-competitive procurement when there's only one source, right? Let's just say it's bespoke goods or bespoke services. If there's only one source that can provide those, then really competitive procurement is infeasible in that case, right? Or if there's an emergency, if there's an emergency in place and we need these goods and services ASAP, then you can use non-competitive methods. There are some limitations there, but that's generally the rule. Or if you, let's just say, go back to the question, you know, we have a desired partner. If we get prior approval from the awarding agency, right, or from the pass-through entity, if they approve it in writing, make sure it's in writing, then you can use non-competitive procurement methods. Or if you've sent out solicitation for bids and you've gotten no response or response from only one entity, then basically what we've determined there is that there's a lack of competition in general. And so we don't really have to use those formal procurement methods in that case. But make sure that when you're carrying out the non-competitive procurement process, that you're documenting it along the way, right? So we're documenting the competitive procurement methods that we're using and our decision making, as well as the non-competitive procurement methods. So document. It's very important, and then store that documentation in more than one secure location. Okay, I'm going to hand this off to Libby to go over some of the other potential requirements on procurement.
Thanks, Kyle. So we've had some questions on these, over the course of these sessions, whether we would cover this. We'll cover it a little bit. There are a lot of, resources online too that go into a little bit more detail. But some of the other potential requirements can include, formally procured construction or facility improvements. They must be adequately protected. So, the performance or payment bonds have to cover 100% of the contract price. But again, that only covers, or that only applies to contracts above that $250,000 threshold, which aligns with that formal procurement threshold. And then this next one, I have another slide with some additional details about this. But this is one we get questions about all the time, is the Davis-Bacon Act. So what that does is it outlines how contractors must pay laborers, and that they must pay them prevailing wages. Those wages have to be paid not less than once per week. And there are some other provisions related to that, but I'll go into a little more detail about Davis-Bacon in a moment. And then this requirement is, a little bit newer, but it's the Build America, Buy America Act. So if this is mostly, for construction, or this is for construction projects, but it requires that iron, steel manufactured projects and construction materials are produced in the United States. And you just want to be sure to pay close attention to whether this is triggered for your specific award or for your specific project, because it can change, it can change the cost. So when you're creating the budget on the front end, you may want to build in a little bit more of a contingency because sometimes those products may be a little bit more expensive. You also want to make sure you're communicating this requirement to your contractor. And ideally, this is a contractor who has dealt with this Build America, Buy America Act before, and they, kind of understand how that works. If they haven't done that before, haven't dealt with that before, just make sure to work really closely with them that, you're ensure you're sourcing all your materials where they need to be sourced from. So there's a link here. So when the slides are sent out, you can look a little bit more closely at the full list of contract provisions too. So diving a little more into Davis-Bacon. So this is this language at the top is this kind of official language about this. Requires all contractors and subcontractors performing construction and repair. This includes painting and decorating work under federal or District of Columbia contracts in excess of $2,000, pay their laborers and mechanics not less than the prevailing wage, and fringe benefits for the geographic location. This is the key part here. This can extend to federal financial assistance programs. So it's not necessarily triggered for every type of federal award if there is construction, but most of the time it will be if you have construction in your project paid for with federal dollars. So requirements under Davis-Bacon, these are the high level things that you need to do to make sure that you are meeting the requirements for this. So those prevailing wage determinations, and those can be found on sam.gov. You want to make sure these can change as often as weekly, and they're very, very specific to geographic area, and they are specific to type of laborer. So there's a different rate for someone who is painting versus someone who is like laying flooring, for example. So you have to be sure that everyone who has a different function on the, construction team or that you're contracting with, they need to be paid at the rate for the work that they're doing. So this can get a little bit complex if multiple workers are doing multiple different types of projects. So this is something your contractor has to make sure that they're looking at closely, that the people on their team are, they know all the different things that they're working on and they're paying them at the correct rate for each different type of work. So yeah, on sam.gov, you can go in and if you search, prevailing wages, sam.gov, the search section there should just pop right up in Google. You'll have to type in your geographic location, and then the most recent sheet of prevailing wages will pop up. And generally, that is locked in at the time that your contract or your budget is created. So you don't usually have to be changing the payment rates throughout. That can be locked in at the beginning of your contract. Also inclusion in procurement documents and contracts. So again, it's ideal if you can work with a contractor who has worked on a project that needed to meet these Davis-Bacon requirements. Then they can, if you haven't done it before, they can help navigate you through it. Or even if you have done it before, it takes some of the, you know, onus off of you as an organization, because the contractor can help cover some of these pieces. Some of this has to be completed by your organization, and you should definitely be double checking all of this. But it can certainly help if the contractor has a good understanding. So another piece, there are related flyers that have to be posted at the work site, that you can download online. When you're starting your contract, they should also provide you with like links to the correct correct documentation. So there's some posters, and then you also have to post, excuse me, the prevailing wages. Again, worker payment at least weekly. You have to provide payroll documentation, and this is maintained by the contractor. So again, there's a lot of trust with your contractor. Overtime must be paid if somebody's working over 40 hours in a single week. Employee interviews and spot checks. So these employee interviews and spot checks have to be completed by the grantee. And they have to be completed during the initial 2 weeks and final 2 weeks. So this is, you know, a little bit more complex, but the contractor has to make all people who are working on the site at the, you know, site of the project available for interviews. Those individuals can deny an interview, but there are, you know, you have to conduct a certain number of interviews, spot checks during these times, and what you'll be looking for is, are they actually being paid the correct rate? And, you know, is the payroll documentation aligning with, you know, what they're actually being paid? And also, are the working conditions what they are, you know, are they meeting the requirements for what they are supposed to be as far as safety and, you know, things of that nature? So there's a lot of different pieces to following Davis-Bacon, but having a good relationship with your contractor and having a good understanding of the requirements will go a long way. Some of the pitfalls to look out for. So misclassification of laborers and mechanics. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different classifications based on the function of a contractor, you know, what they're doing at the job site. So really making sure that we're classifying everyone correctly for the hours that they are doing and the type of work that they are doing. Failure to pay prevailing wage, including fringe benefits. So again, you know, doing those spot checks and having that payroll documentation will help make sure that you're paying that prevailing wage. Inadequate record keeping, failure to submit certified weekly payrolls. So you really need to have someone on your team who is working in concert with the contractor. There are tools that are generally provided to grantees that they can use as a template for some of these payroll documentations that can be really helpful, especially if you're navigating this for the first time. So, you know, talk with your grant manager if you're having to meet these Davis-Bacon requirements. There's usually some tools that they would be able to provide to help make sure that you're capturing all the correct information from the start of your project. Failure to post the correct posters in the work sites. That's easiest to avoid. Just visiting the work site regularly and making sure those are in place is all you need to do for that piece. And again, most challenges can be mitigated by just ensuring both you and your contractor both thoroughly understand the Davis-Bacon requirements. I also recommend having, you know, one main point of contact on your team who is overseeing this aspect of the project. It may be the same person who's overseeing the whole project, but just having one point of contact who is meeting all of these requirements and ensuring all of these requirements are met, you know, is a good way to make sure that nothing is dropped. So I'll pass it back to Kyle to talk more about conflict of interest.
Thanks, Libby. So we're almost through with this. We did want to ask, what is a conflict of interest? We're going to be covering kind of what should be in your conflict of interest policy, but I want to get a sense of who has an idea about what a conflict of interest is. So if you could maybe pop a quick answer in the chat, or at least think of it, get your mind working as we come to the end of this presentation. So any ideas, anybody? Okay. Got some examples of conflicts of interest. Okay. All right. Yeah, those are not bad. Yeah. Personal benefit. Okay, let's go to the answer. So basically a conflict of interest is when an individual or organization's interests kind of preclude them from engaging in impartial decision making, or when your interests kind of are incompatible with those of another entity, right? So if your organization's interest in, let's say, procuring goods and services don't align exactly with those requirements laid out by the federal government, let's say, right? So maybe it's not in your interests to carry out formal procurement methods, but the federal government requires you to. There could be a conflict of interest there, right? So let's just go through an example here. So let's just say your organization needs to hire a project manager under a federal award. And let's just say also the hiring decisions are made by the executive director. Now, if we see the list of qualified candidates includes the executive director's husband, then it probably is a good chance that there's a conflict of interest there, right? And so the executive director is probably going to need to recuse themselves from the hiring process, maybe hand those responsibilities over to, let's say, the board of directors to carry out or to continue on with the hiring process, because we want to avoid a conflict of interest. And it's very likely that the executive director is participating in hiring that, potentially their own husband, that's a violation of conflict of interest standards that are laid out in the organization's policies, but also probably in the federal awarding agency's policies. So what should your conflict of interest policy include? So first and foremost, needs to define what a conflict of interest is, right? So employees are aware, or other members of the organization are aware of what it is. Maybe provide a few examples, right? That's always helpful. Your policy needs to require individuals at your organization to disclose any actual or even potential conflicts of interest. It should describe how you as an organization identify conflicts and how you deal with them, which includes disciplinary actions that are taken if you find out that a conflict of interest hasn't been adequately disclosed, or that there is in fact a conflict of interest that has been essentially hidden from the board, let's say. And this disciplinary action component is kind of what gives your conflict of interest policy teeth, if you will, because if you can identify conflicts of interest, but there's no process laid out about how you deal with it, well, then it's kind of meaningless, right, to have that. And it's important to remember that the federal award recipients need to disclose all actual or potential conflicts of interest, and that process needs to align with the federal awarding agency's conflict of interest policies. And so you need to kind of disclose any actual or potential ones, and that needs to be done in a way that aligns with the federal awarding agency. So that's all we're going to talk about for conflicts of interest. We are going to give you a little quiz now. So if we could pull up the Zoom poll, we'll give you several minutes to complete this. I know we're running a bit short on time. We want to do the Q&A session. But if we could start the Zoom poll, then everyone please answer these to the best of your ability.
We're holding steady at about 45% of respondents answered, Kyle.
Okay, I think we're short on time, so if we can kind of wrap it up, everybody, answer best you can. Let's start going through some of these answers. Okay, so we'll start at the top. True or false? Formal procurement methods are not needed if a contract exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold. So remember that threshold is $250,000. So they are needed. So that is false. We do need formal procurement above that simplified acquisition threshold. True or false? Subawards are granted to contractors who participate in a sealed bidding process. That is false. So those are procurement contracts. Those are granted to contractors who participate in a sealed bidding process, not subawards. Next one, when it comes to subrecipients, pass-through entities must evaluate all of the following except none of the above. So they should evaluate subrecipient financial management systems, subrecipient prior audit findings, fraud risks, compliance risks. They need to be evaluating all of those. Next one, which of the following would most likely be considered a subrecipient? So the answer is C, arborist company that must abide by a pass-through entity's federal award requirements. So remember, subrecipients need to abide by pass-through entity requirements, by the federal award requirements. Contractors do not. So that's kind of the distinguishing factor there. Next one, subawards must include the indirect cost rate applicable to the recipient, to the subrecipient. That is true. We need to include that, and that can either be the de minimis or if they have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, that. But we do need to include that information on the subaward. If an organization suspects that a conflict of interest may exist under a federal award, the organization should report that to the awarding agency. Okay. You also might need to report it to other individuals, but the best answer in this case would be the awarding agency, right? Because that will be a requirement of the funding agency, is to report all potential or actual conflicts of interest. And then fill in the blank. Formal procurement standards help ensure competition is maintained when public dollars are spent on goods and services. It's all about competition. We want to maintain a competitive economic environment to avoid things like self-dealing, unjust enrichment. And I'm glad nobody picked existentialism for that question. Okay, that wraps up the Zoom poll results, and we will dive into the Q&A session now.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, or while we do the Q&A. So I found the U.S. Forest Service often does not put the assistance listing on the award. What is the best way to find that number? So you can search assistance listings on sam.gov, and I will put the link to that in the chat. But this is where you should be able to search and find that information if you are having trouble finding that. Our organization operates in a very small 600 population rural town, and though we have conflict of interest procedures in place, it is inevitable that there are quite a few conflict of interest of both board and employees who help to provide services to accomplish funding. Any further tips for ensuring compliance is in place? So the key there, we work with a lot of organizations that are in similar situation, and so the key there is just reporting that potential conflict of interest and recusing yourself from any evaluation if there's, if they're applying for something, or recusing yourself from that decision making. So as long as it is spoken and it's in some type of writing. So that could be like in the minutes of your board meeting when you're making a decision about a contract or you're reviewing, responses, stating that conflict of interest and, recusing yourself. That said, that's kind of a best practice, but each organization has to create their own conflict of interest. It has to meet certain requirements. And so that's, that may change depending on what's in your conflict of interest policy. So making sure it aligns with federal guidelines and then following your conflict of interest policy is the best course of action. But that's generally what I advise, is just, stating that conflict of interest and then, having it recorded. Would it be a conflict of interest to accept donations, nonprofit PTE, on behalf of a contractor of the grant, for profit, to support the grant gold project they are being contracted to create? So want to make sure I understand that correctly, so it sounds like in this case, a contractor is donating funds to an organization, and then they're also receiving a contract from that organization. And the project is also the project that they're contracted on is the project that they are giving a restricted donation for. That's tricky. I would say, again, you want to follow your conflict of interest policy, whatever is stated in there, and make sure that any donations from that entity are very clear, and that your decision making in the contracting process is very clear about why one group was rejected and why one group was chosen. So if they give a donation to your organization for a project and they want to apply for a contract, they would have to be treated, in the same way as all other applicants are treated, with their, with their response to your RFP, graded or evaluated the same as everyone else. And Lori says, pay to play is never a best practice. And yeah, definitely agree with that, Lori. We can be selective in awarding a contract via the sealed bid process. However, to be transparent, we don't get to pick/choose submissions, correct? So Lori, I think you're saying you don't get to only allow certain people to respond. If I'm understanding that correctly, then that's accurate. You cannot deny certain people or groups from responding. You would have to, accept their response, and then evaluate it the same as all of the other responses. So if someone is the lowest bidder but doesn't meet all of the requirements in your request for proposals, you could still deny them. If that group that you didn't want to pick wins it fair and square according with your requirements in the RFP, they're the lowest bidder, they're the most qualified bidder, then you may be required to give it to them. But as Kyle shared, there are some other considerations, especially if it's architectural and engineering. So there are some exceptions there. What happens if the lowest bidder is not the most responsible bidder? So when you say responsible, do you mean like they don't meet other qualifications in the RFP? Or Lori, can you share a little bit more what you mean by when you say responsible bidder? And then I'll go in the meantime to the next question. Does the NOFO always state if the Build America, Buy America Act applies? or is it on the applicant to determine applicability? It should always say in the NOFO. So, yes, it should be in there if you need that. Does Build America, Buy America include forest products such as wood, lumber, or composite wood products? I think that was in the list. I think lumber is in that list. So yeah, the answer is yes. Does the Davis-Bacon Act also pertain to employees? Davis-Bacon Act is for laborers who are paid through contracts. So while there may be a requirement for employees who are paid under a federal contract to be paid a certain minimum like living wage, that may exist, but that would be separate from the Davis-Bacon Act. Davis-Bacon is specific to laborers and mechanics who are paid through contracts over $2,000. Oh, and then, yeah, Lori says the submission process needs to be transparent while awarding a bid is based on lowest/most responsible. Yes, so lowest and meeting the requirements. So they have to be able to meet the requirements of the contract. Payments beneficial to the individual contractor. Michael, if you could give some maybe additional context of what you're hoping to find out in the chat, that would be helpful. Are there recommended disciplinary actions for violations of conflict of interest? Not necessarily. Most of the conflict of interest policies I've seen are more of a phased approach. So it's like levels of severity in the conflict of interest, and also, you know, what stage or like where that conflict of interest is. There's a potential for it to, I've seen conflict of interest policies where it's grounds for dismissal as as an employee or as a board member, but that is decided on a case-by-case basis. Kyle, do you have any other thoughts on that? Disciplinary actions for conflict of interest?
No, not really. It's generally the case that if a conflict is particularly is omitted, right? Like if you don't disclose it and it's particularly egregious, let's say there's a lot of self-dealing going on, then yeah, grounds for dismissal. But I mean, other disciplinary actions, maybe suspension, maybe losing certain privileges, losing the oversight that you have over a particular department within the organization, maybe. But beyond that, yeah, there's not much else an organization can do, really, right? It's important to emphasize that this is generally at the discretion of the board of directors, and so the board, you need to have good, judicious board members on your board in order to, I guess, properly, suss out whether a conflict requires disciplinary action or not.
Yeah. And again, most of the time, conflicts of interest are evaluated on a case-by-case basis based on the potential impact of that conflict on the organization or on its, legal standing or on its ability to meet its contract requirements. So there are a lot of considerations that can go into a single conflict of interest. And if it's these are on a range. So if it's a more minor conflict of interest that maybe someone didn't realize was a conflict of interest, there might be potential just to, fix that in the moment. But yeah, there's a lot of considerations for that. just to understand, conflicts of interest must be declared to the board, but then also to the agency. So ideally, your conflict of interest would be created in partnership with your board of directors, and they would approve it. And then, yes, it should be shared with employees of your agency. It should be shared with leadership of your agency. And then, of course, your board would also have access to that and abide by that policy. Someone said the contractor wants other entities to donate to their project through us. So I think I hesitate to give a answer on this because it seems like a more complex situation. So I don't want to give you the wrong information. I think I need to know a little bit more about what that is to give an answer. Unless Kyle, you have anything with that.
No, because I don't really know what the nature of the question is. If
Yeah,
we get more info, that'd be helpful.
yeah. When do you have to do a sealed bid? Kyle, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, anytime you're above the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. And then if sealed bids are impracticable, then you resort to proposals, a request for proposals in that case.
And Kyle, could you give an example of when it might not make sense to do a sealed bid and you would then have to do a proposal? Like what would make it impracticable?
Oh goodness.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I think that might be what we're trying to, what the question is here. It's like how to know when to do which one.
Yeah. So let's just say we can't fully describe like what is entailed in this project, right? Like we don't have all of the specifications, and so and we can't make a decision solely on the basis of price, right? Then in that case, sealed bids wouldn't be appropriate. We need to resort to another formal procurement method.
Can federal awards be withdrawn mid-grant execution? Yes, if you are, so to clarify, what they say withdrawn by the federal government. So yes, if you're not meeting your requirements of the award, there are disciplinary action that the federal government can take to halt or suspend your award or deny funding. So, but that historically that has only happened when you're not meeting your requirements for the contract or you're not following CFR guidelines. So you're having issues with your financial management system, your financial reporting is not accurate, you're not tracking everything that you're supposed to be tracking, then they have the power to, cancel your award. Now, with everything that's happening at the federal level now, there's been talk of removing awards and without additional justification necessarily, or without that type of justification. So I will say that remains to be seen. I wish I could give a more, concrete answer. We haven't really seen that in the past. We've only seen that as a disciplinary action. So, I recommend staying in close contact with your grant manager, keeping an eye on things that are happening at the federal level, and we'll see. There are some mechanisms that can cancel federal legislation for funding, but they don't happen very often, or they haven't happened very often in history. So Yeah, sorry, I wish I could give more detail or something more concrete, but I think just paying close attention right now and preparing for any potential scenario is what you should do. What do you know about contractors using a discounted rate for match on a federal award? So I'm interpreting that to mean that they're giving you a discounted rate but by providing partial in-kind services. And so if a federal award allows in-kind services as a match, that could potentially work. However, most of the time for federal applications, you are not allowed to list the name of your contractor because you don't go through, unless it's under that $10,000 threshold, because you don't go through the procurement process usually until after your award, because that hasn't been, awarded yet. If you have gone through your procurement process before you apply and you know who your contract is, and the federal opportunity allows in kind as a match, which it doesn't always, then that should be allowable. Yeah. Anything else about that, Kyle?
No, I think you did a great job breaking that down.
Yeah. So there's, it depends on the context and the scenario, but it could potentially be allowable and count as a match. I'm still confused by when you are required to do a sealed bid versus an RFP. So sealed bid is, you'll want to follow that when you know the price of the contract and you know exactly what you need. So if you're saying, I need to buy 10 specific pieces of equipment and I need to procure that, so I know the fair market value of that, and it's going to cost, $300,000 to get that. I know I need to do a formal procurement process. I know the cost. I know exactly what I need. So I'm going to do sealed bids. Say you are looking for someone who is a contractor, but for a more complex project that has, there's different ways to approach the building of the project. So it could be, using different building materials, using different approaches. There's some variation in cost. And there's also some differences in who they're using as the workers for the project. That would be more of a proposal scenario that would be based on both cost and qualifications for the project. So I hope that helps. So that was our last question. Okay, perfect. And so I'm gonna wrap up the Q&A now and pull the slides back up real quick. So just a reminder to everyone, if you're interested, sign up for the one-on-one sessions. That link is shared by Emery and Emily. Those sessions will be 1 hour, space is limited, and they'll reach out to those who have been selected for that support. And I will pass it back to Emery.
Yeah, thanks so much, Libby and Kyle. That was really educational, and thanks for getting through so many questions. Yeah, please do apply for that one-on-one session if you're interested in that opportunity. We're gonna try to be making some selections in the next couple of days. We'll also be sending that out in the follow-up email. And as a reminder, our 4th session is coming up the week after next, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks so much.